I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. Tonight, warm greetings to London. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. As the new year begins, may it bring you gentle moments, quiet joys, and many comforting stories to enjoy. Please subscribe if you enjoy these cozy evenings. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Barber's Chair Before Christmas. December in St. Mary Mead possessed a quality that Miss Marple had long observed, but never quite managed to put into words. It was not merely the cold, nor the particular slant of winter light through bare branches, nor even the ritual preparations that overtook the village in the fortnight before Christmas. It was rather a sense of quickening, as though the whole community drew itself together against the darkness and found comfort in the repetition of familiar tasks performed at their appointed times. On this particular Thursday morning, the 15th of December in the year 1957, Miss Marple made her way down the high street with her shopping basket over her arm, and her thoughts pleasantly occupied with the question of whether Mrs. Dew at the bakery would have any of the candied peel she required for her Christmas cake. The air was sharp and still, and a thin frost lingered in the shadows where the sun had not yet reached. The postbox gleamed red against the grey stone of the wall behind it, and the shop windows, already decorated with paper chains and sprigs of holly, seemed to glow with an almost conspiratorial warmth. She had attended the early service at the church, as was her custom on Thursdays, and had exchanged brief words with the vicar about the arrangements for the carol service. Now, at 10:30, the village was beginning its daily business with that mixture of purpose and leisure that characterized a community where most people had known one another all their lives. As she passed the small bow-fronted shop with the red and white striped pole beside its door, Miss Marple paused and glanced through the window with the mild interest of one whose apprehensions were not pressing, and whose curiosity about her neighbours was both natural and kindly. The barber's shop was, as always at this time of year, doing a brisk trade. Through the spotless glass she could see 3 figures waiting inside, and Mr. Crow himself, aproned and scissors in hand, attending to a customer whose head was bent forward over the basin. Miss Marple knew Mr. Alfred Crow as well as she knew anyone in St. Mary Mead, which is to say she knew him in the particular way one knows a tradesman whose services one does not personally require, but whose presence forms part of the fabric of village life. He had kept the barber's shop for over 30 years, having taken it over from his father before him, and was a man of perhaps 60, square-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with grey hair trimmed as neatly as one might expect and a face that suggested both competence and discretion. He was known to be fair in his prices, punctual in his hours, and possessed of that quality of trustworthiness that made gentlemen speak more freely than perhaps they ought, while seated in his chair, with a towel about their necks. The shop itself was small but immaculately kept. 2 chairs stood against one wall for those who waited, their green leather worn smooth by years of use. The barber's chair, an impressive piece of furniture with a great deal of chromium plating and a padded headrest, faced a long mirror that reflected not only the customer, but also the entire room behind him, including the curtained doorway that led to the back premises, where Mr. Crow kept his supplies and boiled his kettle for the small comforts of his trade. Miss Marple could see, even from outside, that the usual morning queue had formed. Nearest the window sat Mr. Dennis Hale, retired these 5 years from his position as railway clerk at the station in the neighbouring town. He was a tall, spare man with a long face and a manner that was at once precise and somewhat anxious, as though he feared that disorder might break out at any moment if he did not maintain constant vigilance. His grey suit was pressed to perfection, his tie knotted with geometrical exactness, and his shoes shone with the deep gleam that speaks of daily attention. He held a folded newspaper on his knee and sat very upright, his expression one of patient expectation. Beside him, in the second chair, sat Mrs. Ruth Palmer, a widow of some 50 years who lived in one of the cottages near the church with her son, a young man who worked in the offices of a solicitor in the town. Mrs. Palmer was a practical woman, thick-set and capable, with iron-grey hair and a face that suggested both good humour and a certain wariness about accepting anything she had not first examined for herself. She wore a brown coat and carried a large handbag on her lap, and she appeared to be waiting not for herself but for someone who had not yet arrived. The third person in the shop was a young man Miss Marple did not immediately recognise, though something about the set of his shoulders and the dark hair visible above his collar struck a faint chord of memory. He stood rather than sat, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, and his attention seemed fixed not on the proceedings in the barber's chair, but on his own reflection in the mirror, though his gaze was distant and preoccupied. As Miss Marple watched, Mr. Crow straightened from his work and whipped the towel from his customer's shoulders with a practised flourish. The customer rose, paid, exchanged a few words, and departed, setting the bell above the door jingling. Mr. Hale stood at once and moved to the chair, with the air of one taking up a position that was rightfully his. Miss Marple continued, on her way, her mind turning over the small scene she had witnessed, with that gentle, reflective attention she brought to most observations of village life. There was something rather pleasant, she thought, about the way such rituals persisted unchanged. Men had been having their hair cut before Christmas in just this way for generations, and would continue to do so as long as there were barbers and customers who valued neatness and the opportunity for a quarter hour of conversation in warm surroundings. She completed her shopping without haste, obtaining the candied peel and a number of other small necessities, and found herself, some 40 minutes later, walking back along the high street in the company of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had emerged from the draper's shop with a parcel under her arm just as Miss Marple was passing. Mrs. Bantry was an old friend, a woman of generous proportions and equally generous spirits, whose conversation tended to range over a wide variety of subjects, without particular regard for their connection to one another. She was at present concerned with the difficulty of finding suitable gifts for one's godchildren, the unreliability of the postal service during the Christmas season, and the question of whether the Women's Institute would be serving mince pies or sausage rolls at their Christmas gathering. As they passed the barber's shop, Miss Marple glanced once more through the window. The queue had dispersed, and Mr. Crow stood alone in his shop, tidying his implements with the unhurried care of a craftsman who took pride in his work. The striped pole beside the door turned slowly in the faint breeze, its colours bright against the grey morning. "I always think," Miss Marple remarked, "that mirrors must hear a great deal more than they show." Mrs. Bantry looked at her with the mild surprise. "Mirrors, Jane? Whatever do you mean?" "Oh, merely that a barber's mirror sees every customer who comes and goes and hears every word spoken in confidence. Mr. Crow has been cutting hair in St. Mary Mead for over 30 years. One wonders what accumulated wisdom such a mirror might possess, if it could speak." "Goodness," said Mrs. Bantry, laughing. "What a thought! Though I suppose barbers do hear rather a lot. Like publicans, one imagines, or doctors." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "And Mr. Crow is known to be very discreet." "Oh, absolutely. One of the old school, you know. Takes pride in his work and minds his own business." They walked on together, discussing other matters, and presently parted at the corner, where Mrs. Bantry's path led toward the larger houses on the edge of the village. Miss Marple continued homeward, her basket over her arm and her thoughts drifting in that gentle, seemingly aimless way that was nevertheless capable of arriving at quite definite conclusions when required. The young man in the barber's shop, she thought, had been Stephen Lorimer. She remembered him now. He had grown up in the village, but had gone away some years ago, and there had been some small difficulty about him when he was younger. Something to do with Mr. Crow, she seemed to recall, though the details escaped her. A correction of some kind, publicly administered. Young people were often sensitive about such things, and memories could linger long after the incident itself had been forgotten by everyone else. Still, it was pleasant to see familiar faces return to the village for Christmas. St. Mary Mead was at its best when its children came home, even if they had not always parted on the best of terms. The day passed in its usual fashion, and evening came early, as it does in December. Miss Marple prepared her supper, tended to her correspondence, and settled herself by the fire with her knitting. Outside the frost deepened, and the village grew quiet under a sky brilliant with stars. Everything, she thought, was as it should be. The rituals of December were proceeding in their appointed order, and tomorrow would bring its own small pleasures and obligations. She had no reason to suppose that the morning would bring anything other than the usual round of village news and gentle activity. No reason at all. Chapter 2. A Shop That Did Not Open. Friday morning arrived with a peculiar stillness that seemed to press against the windows of St. Mary Mead. The frost that had been tentative the day before had settled in with determination during the night, and the village woke to a world transformed into something brittle and precise. Every blade of grass stood separate and distinct, edged with white, and the puddles in the lane had become sheets of clouded glass. Miss Marple, who woke early by habit and inclination, noticed the quality of the light before she had quite finished dressing. It was the hard, flat light of deep cold, and it gave to familiar objects a clarity that was almost unnatural. She moved through her morning routine with her usual methodical care, though she found herself pausing more than once at the window, looking out at the transformed garden with that mixture of appreciation and unease that extreme weather sometimes produced. By 9 o'clock she had breakfast, tidied her small sitting room, and was considering whether to venture out for her customary morning walk or to remain indoors with her knitting and the letters she had been meaning to answer for the better part of a week. The decision was made for her when she observed through her front window Mrs. Ledbetter from the corner shop hurrying past with her shawl clutched tight about her shoulders and her face wearing an expression of distinct agitation. Miss Marple knew that expression. It was the look of someone who has encountered news of an unsettling nature and is hastening to share it with the next available listener. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, news travelled with remarkable efficiency, though not always with corresponding accuracy, and Miss Marple had long since learned to discount approximately half of what she heard in the first telling, and to wait for the second or third version before forming any conclusions. She put on her coat and hat and stepped outside into air that seemed to catch at the back of her throat. The cold was the sort that made one's eyes water and one's fingers ache even through gloves, and she was careful of her footing on the path, which was treacherous with ice. The high street, when she reached it, presented an unusual aspect. Small knots of people stood about in attitudes of conversation, and there was about their manner something at once subdued and animated that suggested the kind of news that requires a lowered voice, but cannot be kept silent. Miss Marple observed Mr. Emmett from the greengrocer's standing outside his shop despite the cold, in conversation with the postman, and Mrs. Hart from the tobacconist speaking with considerable emphasis to two women whose backs were turned. What drew the eye most particularly, however, was the barber's shop. The door remained closed, though by this hour on a Friday morning it ought to have been open for business. The striped pole, which yesterday had turned slowly in the breeze, now stood motionless, and there was something about the dark window and the general air of absence that created a small gap in the familiar pattern of the street, as though a tooth had been pulled from an otherwise complete set. Miss Marple walked on slowly, noting the altered atmosphere without appearing to do so. She had nearly reached the post office when she encountered Mrs. Bantry, who emerged from that establishment with a telegram form in her hand and a look of considerable distress. "Jane," said Mrs. Bantry at once in the manner of one who has been waiting for exactly this meeting, "have you heard?" "I have heard nothing," said Miss Marple, "but I observe that the barber's shop has not opened this morning and that the village appears unsettled." "Unsettled," repeated Mrs. Bantry. "My dear, it's considerably worse than unsettled. Mr. Crow has been found dead, in his shop, or rather behind it in the back room. Mrs. Dew found him when she went to deliver his bread this morning. The door was unlocked, you see, and when he didn't answer she went in, and there he was, behind the curtain where he keeps his coats and things." Miss Marple stood very still for a moment. The cold seemed to intensify, and the voices around them faded to a general murmur that meant nothing. "Dead," she said quietly. "Poor Mr. Crow. How very sad. Had he been ill?" "That's just it," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice still further. "No one knew of any illness, and Mrs. Dew said there was something not quite right about it all, though she wouldn't say exactly what. The doctor has been sent for and Inspector Slack arrived about 20 minutes ago. I saw his motor car outside the shop when I came past." Inspector Slack was known to both of them, though neither lady regarded him with particular enthusiasm. He was a man of energy and conviction, who preferred straightforward explanations and became notably irritable when presented with anything that suggested complication or ambiguity. "The inspector is there now?" asked Miss Marple. "Yes, and looking very grim indeed. He spoke to no one, just went straight into the shop and shut the door behind him. The constable is standing outside, keeping people away, though of course everyone is trying to see what's happening." Miss Marple glanced back along the street toward the barber's shop. A small crowd had indeed gathered at a respectful distance from the doorway, and she could see the substantial figure of Constable Polk standing with his arms folded, radiating official discouragement. "It seems very sudden," she said. "I saw Mr. Crow only yesterday morning, and he appeared quite well. He was attending to his customers in the usual way." "That's what everyone is saying," Mrs. Bantry replied. "He seemed perfectly normal yesterday. The shop was open all day and he closed at the usual time. And this morning he simply didn't open, and when Mrs. Dew went in, there he was. It's all very shocking." They stood together in silence for a moment, and Miss Marple became aware of other conversations taking place around them, fragments of speculation and recollection that formed a kind of verbal mosaic of the village's collective response to unexpected mortality. "He was always so careful," someone was saying. "One never knows, does one?" another voice responded. "Here today and gone tomorrow. Such a reliable man. Never missed a day in all the years I've known him." Miss Marple listened, without appearing to listen, a skill she had perfected over many years of village life. She noted the tone of the voices, the particular words chosen, the slight differences in emphasis that distinguished genuine shock from the kind of agitation that was more about the excitement of the event than sorrow for the person involved. "I must call on Mrs. Palmer," she said presently. "She was in the shop yesterday morning waiting for her son. She will be very distressed." "Oh, I shouldn't think her son was having his hair cut," said Mrs. Bantry. "Mrs. Palmer goes along to keep Mr. Crow company sometimes, you know. They were old friends, after a fashion. She'll be very upset indeed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The picture was beginning to form in her mind, though its outlines were still indistinct. A barber's shop on a Thursday morning in December, with its usual complement of customers, and the familiar rituals of conversation and careful grooming, and then, less than 24 hours later, silence and locked doors and the kind of careful phrases people use when they did not quite wish to speak plainly about what had occurred. "The kettle," she said suddenly. Mrs. Bantry looked at her. "I beg your pardon? Mrs. Dew mentioned the kettle, did she not? When she found Mr. Crow?" "I don't know that she did. At least not to me. Why should the kettle matter?" "Perhaps it doesn't," said Miss Marple. "I was merely thinking that Mr. Crow always boiled his kettle in the morning. He made tea for himself between customers. It was one of his small habits." She did not elaborate, and Mrs. Bantry, who had known her long enough to recognise when silence was more useful than speech, did not press the point. They parted soon after, Mrs. Bantry to send her telegram and Miss Marple to make her way slowly back along the high street, observing as she went the various groupings of villagers and the manner in which they spoke to one another. There was shock, certainly, and a kind of subdued excitement, but there was also something else, a wariness, perhaps, a sense that the familiar order of things had been disturbed in a way that went beyond the simple fact of one man's death. As she passed the barber's shop, she noted the striped pole, now perfectly still in the windless air. The frost had settled on it during the night, and it wore a thin coating of white that made the red and blue stripes seem distant and muted, as though seen through a veil. Inspector Slack emerged from the shop as she drew level with it. He was a large man with a red face and an air of perpetual grievance, and he glanced at Miss Marple with the expression of one who suspects that complications are about to multiply. "Good morning, Inspector," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Morning," he replied shortly. "Nasty business, this." "Very sad," agreed Miss Marple. "Poor Mr. Crow, he will be much missed." The inspector grunted. "Missed or not, he's gone, and there are questions that want answering. Lot of people in and out of this shop yesterday, and now I've got to speak to every last one of them. Takes time, that does." "I'm sure you'll be very thorough," said Miss Marple. "You always are." He looked at her suspiciously, uncertain whether this was a compliment or something else entirely, and then turned back to the shop with a nod that suggested their conversation was concluded. Miss Marple continued homeward, moving carefully on the icy pavement. The morning had taken on a quality quite different from what she had anticipated when she rose. The village, which had seemed yesterday to be moving peacefully through its customary December rituals, had suddenly become a place of questions and uncertainty. She thought of Mr. Crow as she had last seen him, standing alone in his shop and tidying his implements with the unhurried precision of long practice. She thought of the customers who had been there that morning. Mr. Hale with his newspaper and his pressed suit, Mrs. Palmer waiting with her handbag, young Stephen Lorimer watching his reflection with that distant, preoccupied expression. And she thought of mirrors, and of how much they saw and heard, and of the curious fact that sometimes the things people had said in confidence, believing themselves safe among familiar surroundings, could prove to be the most dangerous utterances of all. The barber's chair, she reflected, was a place of trust. Men sat with towels about their necks and their eyes closed, vulnerable and at ease, speaking of matters they might not mention elsewhere. And Mr. Crow, with his scissors and his razor and his careful discretion, had been the guardian of 3 decades' worth of such confidences. One wondered sometimes what became of secrets when the keeper of them was no longer present to maintain their safety. By afternoon, St. Mary Mead had grown quieter than it had been for years. The shops remained open, and business of a sort continued, but there was an absence in the air, a sense of something withdrawn. People spoke in careful phrases, if they spoke at all, and when they passed the barber's shop they looked straight ahead and quickened their pace, as though the building itself had become something to be avoided. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire that evening with her knitting, found herself thinking not of death but of silence, and of the many forms it could take. Chapter 3. The Smell of Bay Rum. Saturday brought no softening of the weather. If anything, the cold had deepened and the sky hung low and grey over St. Mary Mead, with the particular heaviness that suggested snow might come before nightfall. Miss Marple, looking out at her garden in the early morning, noted the way the birds moved about with a kind of urgent efficiency, as though they too sensed a change approaching and were preparing accordingly. She had slept poorly, which was unusual for her. Her mind had turned over the events of the previous day with a persistence that defied her attempts at distraction, and when she had finally dozed, her dreams had been fragmentary and unsettling, filled with images of mirrors and turning poles and the sound of scissors cutting through silence. The village had remained subdued throughout Friday, and Miss Marple, making her necessary errands in the afternoon, had noted the way conversation stopped when she approached and resumed only after she had passed. It was not that anyone suspected her of particular knowledge or involvement. Rather, it was the natural reticence of a community that had not yet determined what to say about an event that touched everyone, but belonged to no one in particular. She had learned, through the reliable conduit of her cleaning woman Mrs. Hart, that de Haydock had been with Inspector Slack for some considerable time on Friday afternoon, and that their conversation, conducted behind the closed door of the surgery, had been of a serious nature. Mrs. Hart, whose sister cleaned for the doctor, reported that when the inspector had emerged, he had looked, if possible, even grimmer than usual, and had departed without the customary pleasantries that even he generally observed. Now, on Saturday morning, Miss Marple found herself thinking not of death itself, but of the small details that surrounded it. She remembered walking past the barber shop on Thursday morning and pausing to glance through the window. She remembered the queue of customers and the general air of orderly routine, and she remembered quite distinctly the sharp, clean scent of bay rum that had reached her even through the closed door. Bay rum was the scent of Mr. Crow's establishment. It had been so for as long as Miss Marple could recall. It was what distinguished a visit to the barber from any other errand in the village. That particular combination of bay rum and soap and the faint warmth of steam from the kettle in the back room. Gentlemen emerged from their appointments smelling pleasantly of it. and on warm summer days when the door stood open, the fragrance drifted out onto the high street and mingled with the other familiar odours of village commerce. Miss Marple put on her warmest coat and her stoutest shoes and set out for the vicarage. She had promised Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, that she would help with the final preparations for the Christmas bazaar, which was to be held on the following Saturday in the church hall. It was the sort of commitment that could not be postponed on account of general unpleasantness, and Miss Marple rather welcomed the prospect of useful occupation. She took the path that led past the church, avoiding the high street and the barber shop, though this route was longer and somewhat less convenient. As she walked, she passed Mrs. Palmer's cottage, a neat stone building with a small front garden and lace curtains at the windows. On impulse, she paused at the gate. The cottage had an air of quietness about it that seemed more than merely the absence of activity. Miss Marple had known Ruth Palmer for many years, though not intimately. She was a woman who kept her own counsel and managed her affairs with competent independence, and while she was civil to her neighbours, she did not invite particular closeness. As Miss Marple stood considering whether to knock, the door opened and Mrs. Palmer herself appeared, dressed in her brown coat and carrying a shopping basket. She started slightly at finding someone at her gate, then composed her features into an expression of polite acknowledgement. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Mrs. Palmer. I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing and thought I might offer my condolences. I understand you are acquainted with Mr. Crowe." Mrs. Palmer's face, which was naturally somewhat guarded, became more so. "We were old friends," she said. "Not close, you understand, but we had known each other a great many years. It's a shock, naturally." "A great shock," agreed Miss Marple, "particularly as he seemed quite well on Thursday. I saw the shop myself that morning and everything appeared normal." "Yes," said Mrs. Palmer. "I was there myself, waiting for my son. Mr. Crowe seemed just as usual, perhaps a bit preoccupied, but nothing more than that." Miss Marple noted the careful precision of the phrasing. "Preoccupied," she said gently. "In what way?" Mrs. Palmer hesitated, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she would not answer. Then she said with a slight shrug, "He seemed worried, I thought. Not obviously so, but I've known him long enough to recognise when something was troubling him. He was quieter than usual, less inclined to conversation." "Did he mention what was concerning him?" "No, and I didn't ask. It wasn't my place to pry." Mrs. Palmer adjusted her grip on her basket. "I must go, Miss Marple. I have marketing to do, and the shops will be busy." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her pass, and Mrs. Palmer walked briskly away in the direction of the high street, her back very straight and her manner suggesting that the conversation was concluded to her satisfaction, if not to Miss Marple's. Miss Marple continued on her way, turning over this brief exchange in her mind. Mrs. Palmer had said that Mr. Crowe seemed worried, which was interesting in itself, but more interesting, perhaps, was the vagueness with which she had described her visit to the shop. She had been there, waiting for her son, but she had not said whether her son had actually arrived, or whether she had remained throughout his appointment, or indeed anything specific about the duration or purpose of her presence. People who had nothing to conceal, Miss Marple reflected, generally spoke with greater particularity. They remembered details because details mattered to them, because the events of their day formed a coherent narrative in which each element connected naturally to the next. Vagueness suggested either a poor memory or a deliberate avoidance of specifics, and Mrs. Palmer did not strike her as a woman whose memory was deficient. The vicarage, when she reached it, was warm and bustling with activity. Mrs. Clement was a small, energetic woman who approached all tasks with determined cheerfulness, and she greeted Miss Marple with evident relief. "Jane, how good of you to come. I'm drowning in raffle tickets and nobody can find the box of decorations. The Reverend has gone to comfort Mrs. Dew, who is still very distressed about finding poor Mr. Crowe, and I'm left to manage everything on my own." They settled into the familiar routine of sorting and arranging, and for a time the conversation ran on ordinary channels. But presently Mrs. Clement, who was never one to avoid a subject merely because it was uncomfortable, returned to the matter that occupied everyone's thoughts. "It's very strange," she said. wrapping tissue paper around a set of donated teacups. Mr. Crow was always so careful about his health. Never a day's illness that I can remember. And now this. "The doctor has said nothing publicly?" asked Miss Marple. "Not that I've heard, though I did encounter Dr. Haydock yesterday evening, and he looked very grave indeed. He wouldn't discuss it, of course, but one could tell it had affected him." Miss Marple considered this. Dr. Haydock was not a man given to excessive emotion, but he was conscientious and took the deaths of his patients seriously, particularly when they occurred unexpectedly. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that the circumstances were unusual." The Reverend said Mrs. Dew mentioned something about the back room, about finding him there, behind the curtain where he kept his outdoor things. She said the kettle was still warm, which suggested he hadn't been gone long, and she said the smell of bay rum was very strong, stronger than usual, she thought, though she couldn't say why she noticed it particularly. Miss Marple's hand stilled over the box of ribbon she had been untangling. The smell of bay rum was strong? Yes. Isn't that odd? One would think it would simply smell as it always did. But Mrs. Dew was quite specific about it. She said it was the first thing she noticed when she went through to the back, even before she saw Mr. Crow himself. "How very curious," said Miss Marple. They worked on in silence for a time, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of bay rum and kettles and the various small details that taken individually meant nothing very much, but which, when assembled together, might form a picture quite different from what first appeared. Bay rum was used after shaving. It was applied to the skin with a practised hand in quantities sufficient to be pleasant but not overwhelming, for the scent to linger so strongly that it was notable even to someone accustomed to the shop suggested either a great quantity had been used or it had been spilled. And if it had been spilled, the question became by whom and under what circumstances. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Crow's careful habits, his precision with his tools, his pride in maintaining his shop to the highest standards. He was not a man who would carelessly overturn a bottle of bay rum any more than he would leave his scissors lying about or neglect to sweep the hair from his floor. Which suggested, perhaps, that something had occurred on Thursday which disrupted his customary routine, something sudden, something that had caused haste or distraction, or a disturbance of the usual order. She thought of the customers who had been present that morning. Mr. Hale, so precise in his own habits. Mrs. Palmer, who had seemed worried and had spoken vaguely. Young Stephen Lorimer, watching his reflection with that distant gaze. One of them, perhaps, held a piece of this puzzle. Or perhaps all of them did, each holding a fragment that they did not recognize as significant because they did not see the whole. Miss Marple folded the last length of ribbon and placed it carefully in its box. Outside, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, drifting past the vicarage windows with lazy inevitability. "I think," she said quietly, "that we shall have a white Christmas this year." Mrs. Clement glanced up from her work. "Oh, I do hope so. It makes everything so much more festive, doesn't it?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though snow has a way of covering things up as well as making them beautiful. One must be careful what one walks over, or one might miss what lies beneath." Mrs. Clement looked at her curiously but said nothing, and they returned to their preparations in companionable silence while the snow continued to fall. Chapter 4, Words Spoken While Waiting. The snow that had begun on Saturday afternoon continued through the night and into Sunday morning, transforming St. Mary Mead into something from a Christmas card. The village looked its best under snow, Miss Marple thought, as she made her careful way to church. The grey stone buildings wore their white caps with dignity, and even the most ordinary cottage took on a certain charm when viewed through the softening veil of falling flakes. The church was fuller than usual, which was often the case when something troubling had occurred in the village. People sought comfort in familiar rituals, and the Sunday service provided an opportunity for the community to gather in a context that required no awkward conversation or expression of sentiment. One could simply be present, and that was sufficient. Miss Marple took her customary seat near the middle of the nave and observed the congregation as it assembled. Mrs. Palmer sat toward the back, her face composed and her hymn book held precisely in both hands. Mr. Dennis Hale occupied a pew 3 rows ahead, his posture as upright as ever, though there was something about the set of his shoulders that suggested a tension not entirely attributable to the hardness of the wooden seat. Young Stephen Lorimer was not present, which Miss Marple noted without particular surprise. The young were often irregular in their church attendance, particularly when they had been away from the village and had fallen out of the habit. The vicar's sermon, delivered with gentle tact, touched upon the theme of mortality and the consolation of faith without making specific reference to Mr. Crow. Nevertheless, everyone understood to whom the words were directed, and when the congregation filed out after the service, there was a subdued quality to the usual Sunday greetings exchanged on the church path. Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mr. Hale, who had evidently timed his departure to coincide with hers. He greeted her with his customary formality and fell into step beside her as they made their way through the churchyard. A difficult week for the village, he observed, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Indeed, said Miss Marple. Poor Mr. Crow. It has been a shock to everyone. A great shock, agreed Mr. Hale. I had an appointment with him only on Thursday morning, you know. He seemed perfectly well. Perfectly well indeed. I've been turning it over in my mind ever since, wondering if there was anything I might have noticed, any sign of distress or ill health, but I can recall nothing of the sort. Miss Marple glanced at him with interest. You saw him on Thursday morning? That must have been just before I passed the shop myself. Very likely. I was his first customer of the day, as I generally am on Thursdays. I prefer the early appointment. One gets the full benefit of his attention, and there's no sense of being hurried. And he seemed quite himself. Mr. Hale paused, as though giving the question serious consideration. Quite himself, he said at last. Though now that you mention it, he was perhaps a trifle distracted. Nothing obvious, you understand. His work was impeccable as always, but I had the impression that his mind was elsewhere. He responded to my remarks rather more slowly than usual, and once or twice I had to repeat myself. How curious, said Miss Marple. Did he mention anything that might account for this distraction? No, nothing at all. We spoke of the usual matters, the weather, the preparations for Christmas, the state of the roads, nothing of any consequence. Mr. Hale hesitated, then added, though I do recall that when I mentioned seeing young Lorimer back in the village, Mr. Crow's expression changed rather noticeably. Changed in what way? It's difficult to describe precisely. A sort of tightening about the mouth, perhaps. A certain coolness. He said nothing, merely nodded and continued with his work, but it was marked enough that I noticed it. They had reached the gate that led out of the churchyard, and Mr. Hale paused with his hand on the cold iron. I have given a full account to Inspector Slack, naturally. He was most thorough in his questioning, most thorough indeed. He wished to know exactly what time I arrived, how long I remained, whether I observed anyone else in the vicinity. I was able to provide precise answers to all of his questions. I'm sure that was very helpful, said Miss Marple. One tries to be of assistance, said Mr. Hale, though I confess I found the entire interview rather distressing. The inspector seemed to regard every detail as potentially significant, which made one conscious of the weight of one's words. I found myself being extremely careful in my phrasing, which is not a natural state of affairs. Miss Marple understood this perfectly. Inspector Slack had a talent for making even the most innocent witness feel as though they were concealing something simply by the virtue of his manner of questioning. It was not a helpful quality in an investigator, though she supposed it occasionally produced results. They parted at the corner, Mr. Hale continuing toward his cottage on the edge of the village, and Miss Marple making her way home through the softly falling snow. As she walked, she thought about what he had said. He had been careful to establish the exactness of his recollection, the precision of his observations, the thoroughness with which he had assisted the inspector. It was the behaviour of a man anxious to demonstrate his complete cooperation and innocence, which might mean nothing at all, or might mean a great deal. Miss Marple had observed over many years that those who had nothing to hide generally felt less need to emphasize their transparency. They spoke naturally and without particular care, secure in the knowledge that the truth required no embellishment or careful phrasing. Those who chose their words with obvious deliberation were often, though not always, those who feared that an incautious statement might reveal more than they intended. She thought of Mr. Hale's description of his visit to the barber shop, first customer of the day, as he generally was on Thursdays. The full benefit of Mr. Crow's attention. Impeccable work, though the barber had seemed distracted. A tightening about the mouth when Stephen Lorimer's name was mentioned. And she thought of something else Mr. Hale had mentioned, almost in passing. He had said that he preferred the early appointment because there was no sense of being hurried, which suggested that on other occasions, perhaps when the shop was busy, there had been such a sense. That Mr. Crow, for all his skill and care, had occasionally given the impression of wanting to move things along to attend to the next customer, to conclude the current appointment. But on Thursday morning, according to Mr. Hale, there had been no such impression. Mr. Crow had been distracted but not hurried. His mind had been elsewhere, but he had not rushed his work. Miss Marple let herself into her cottage and removed her snow-dampened coat and gloves. The house was cold and she busied herself with laying a fire and preparing a simple lunch. As she worked, her thoughts continued to circle around the events of Thursday morning. Mrs. Palmer had said that Mr. Crow seemed worried. Mr. Hale had said he seemed distracted. Both had been present in the shop at approximately the same time, yet their observations differed in emphasis. Mrs. Palmer had noticed worry. Mr. Hale had noticed distraction. It was possible, of course, that both were correct, that Mr. Crow had been both worried and distracted, but it was also possible that each observer had seen what they were prepared to see, or what their own state of mind inclined them to notice. She thought of Mrs. Palmer's vagueness about her visit, the way she had spoken of waiting for her son, but had provided no details about whether he had arrived or what had transpired. And she thought of Mr. Hale's precision, his careful accounting of times and observations, his emphasis on how thoroughly he had assisted Inspector Slack. Two people waiting in the same shop, observing the same man, yet their accounts were curiously incomplete in different ways. Mrs. Palmer's was vague where one might expect specificity. Mr. Hale's was detailed where one might expect casualness. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire with her knitting, and allowed her mind to drift back to other cases, other villages, other instances where people had spoken carefully about events they wished to describe without quite revealing. There had been a case in Much Benham years ago, where a housekeeper had provided an extraordinarily detailed account of her movements on the evening her employer died. Every quarter hour accounted for, every task enumerated. It had seemed at first like the testimony of a conscientious servant anxious to demonstrate her diligence. But as the investigation proceeded, it had become clear that the very precision of the account was what made it suspect. Truth, Miss Marple had observed, was often untidy. People forgot small details, confused the order of events, estimated times rather than stating them exactly. Only when they had reason to be certain did they speak with such exactitude. The housekeeper in Much Benham had been certain because she had carefully constructed her account to align with specific times that could be verified. She had built an alibi out of ordinary tasks, and it had held together until someone noticed that one of those tasks could not possibly have been performed in the way she described. Miss Marple did not suppose that Mr. Hale had done anything so crude as to construct a false account of his movements, but his need to emphasize the precision of his recollection was interesting nonetheless. So the snow continued to fall, and the light began to fade, though it was barely afternoon. The shortest days of the year were upon them, and darkness came early. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Crow's shop, closed now and silent, its striped pole motionless under its cap of white. Words spoken while waiting, she reflected, often revealed more than words spoken under other circumstances. When people waited, they filled the silence with conversation, sometimes saying more than they might have intended. And Mr. Crow, patient and discreet behind his chair, had listened to 3 decades of such confidences. The question was what he had heard on Thursday morning that had made someone decide silence was no longer safe. Chapter 5, Hair on the Wrong Sleeve. Monday morning arrived with a cessation of snow but no warming of the temperature. The village lay under its white covering in a state of peculiar stillness, as though holding its breath. Miss Marple woke early and found herself thinking, before she was quite fully conscious, of something that had been troubling the edges of her mind since Thursday. It was a small thing, hardly worth mentioning, and yet it persisted in returning to her attention with the quiet insistence of details that refused to be dismissed. She lay in bed for a few moments, watching the pale light strengthen against her curtains, and allowed the memory to surface fully. She had been standing outside the barber shop on Thursday morning, looking through the window while speaking with Mrs. Bantry about candied peel and the demands of Christmas preparations. Inside, Mr. Hale had been waiting in his chair, upright and neat as always, his newspaper folded on his knee and on the sleeve of his light grey coat just above the cuff. There had been a single dark hair. Miss Marple rose and dressed with her usual care, though her movements were perhaps slower than customary, as her mind was engaged elsewhere. The hair had been noticeable precisely because Mr. Hale was not a man who tolerated untidiness. His clothes were always immaculate, his shoes always polished, his person always brushed and correct. She had observed him on countless occasions, and never had she seen him with so much as a thread out of place. Yet on Thursday morning, before his appointment with the barber, there had been a hair on his sleeve, a fine dark hair that stood out against the pale fabric. After breakfast, Miss Marple put on her warmest things and ventured out into the cold morning. She had promised to call on old Mrs. Henderson, who lived alone in one of the almshouses near the church, and was often forgotten by her more active neighbours. It was the sort of errand that combined Christian duty with the opportunity for useful conversation, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that one's charitable visits often yielded unexpected information. Her route took her past the post office, where she encountered Mrs. Bantry emerging with a parcel under her arm and a look of mild exasperation on her face. "The postal service becomes more unreliable every year," Mrs. Bantry announced. "This should have arrived on Friday, and here it is Monday morning. How one is meant to manage Christmas shopping when parcels arrive when they please, I cannot imagine." They walked together for a short distance, and presently Mrs. Bantry returned, as conversations in the village invariably did these days, to the subject of Mr. Crow. "Inspector Slack has been asking questions all over the village," she said. "Very thorough sound, apparently, though one wonders what he expects to discover. Poor Mr. Crow's death was surely natural, however sudden it may have been. Has the inspector suggested otherwise?" asked Miss Marple. "Not in so many words, but there's something in his manner that makes one uneasy. He questioned the Reverend yesterday evening about who might have borne Mr. Crow any ill will, which seems an extraordinary thing to ask about a barber. Who bears ill will to their barber?" Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been agreement. "One imagines," she said carefully, "that a barber, like any person who provides a service over many years, might occasionally give offence, perhaps through something overheard and repeated, or through a professional judgment that was not appreciated." "I suppose that's possible," said Mrs. Bantry, doubtfully, "though Mr. Crow was always so discreet. One felt one could say anything in his shop and it would go no further." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "That is precisely the difficulty, is it not? When one feels safe, one speaks freely, and sometimes one says things that, upon reflection, one would prefer had remained unspoken." They parted shortly thereafter, and Miss Marple continued to Mrs. Henderson's cottage. The old lady was delighted to have company, and insisted on providing tea despite Miss Marple's protests that she had only recently breakfasted. They settled by the fire, and for a time the conversation ran on comfortable, inconsequential topics. But presently Mrs. Henderson, who was deaf enough to speak loudly but not so deaf that she missed what was said around her, turned to the matter occupying everyone's thoughts. "I saw Mr. Hale yesterday," she said, "after church, walking with that stiff way he has, as though he's afraid something might become disarranged. He's always been that way, ever since he was a young man. His mother was the same, God rest her. Everything had to be just so." "Some people find comfort in order," observed Miss Marple. "Oh, certainly, though it can become rather tyrannical, can't it? I remember when Mr. Hale first retired from the railway, he couldn't seem to settle. Used to walk up and down the high street at exactly the same time every day, and if anyone interrupted his routine, he became quite agitated. It took him the better part of a year to accept that retirement meant one needn't run one's life by the clock anymore." Miss Marple sipped her tea and considered this. "I believe he still maintains a regular schedule. His appointments with Mr. Crow, for instance, were always at the same time each week." "Thursday mornings, first thing," confirmed Mrs. Henderson. "Like clockwork. Everyone knew it. You could set your watch by Mr. Hale's visits to the barber." "And did he always brush his coat so carefully afterward?" Mrs. Henderson looked at her curiously. "Brush his coat? Well, yes, I suppose so. Though I can't say I've paid particular attention. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," said Miss Marple. "I merely noticed on Thursday that he seemed very particular about his appearance. Even before his appointment, one would think a man going to have his hair cut might be less concerned about such matters until afterward." "That's Mr. Hale all over," said Mrs. Henderson with a chuckle. "Particular before, during and after. Though I did see him once, must have been 6 or 7 years ago, when he'd been helping his nephew move house. Covered in dust he was, and looking quite uncomfortable about it. But that was a rare occasion. Generally speaking, you'll not find a neater man in the village." Miss Marple finished her tea and took her leave, promising to visit again before Christmas. As she walked home through the cold streets, she found herself reconstructing the scene outside the barber's shop on Thursday morning with greater attention to detail. Mr. Hale had been sitting in the waiting chair, dressed in his light grey coat. The coat had been buttoned, as one would expect on a cold December morning, and on the sleeve, clearly visible even from outside the shop, had been that single dark hair. Mr. Hale's own hair was grey, thinning but still present. The hair on his sleeve had been dark, almost black, too dark to be his own and certainly too conspicuous to have been overlooked by a man of his fastidious habits, which suggested that it had been acquired recently, perhaps that very morning, and had not yet been noticed by its bearer. Or had been noticed but could not conveniently be removed at that particular moment. Miss Marple thought of the sequence of events as they must have occurred. Mr. Hale arriving at the barber's shop for his regular Thursday morning appointment, taking his place in the waiting chair, sitting with his newspaper, his coat still buttoned against the cold. But if the hair had been acquired before his arrival at the shop, where had it come from? And more significantly, whose hair was it? She arrived home to find a note from Inspector Slack requesting that she call at the police station at her convenience to answer a few questions. The note was polite but firm, and Miss Marple recognised the tone of a man who expected his request to be treated as commands. She changed her shoes for a sturdier pair and made her way to the small building that served St. Mary Mead as both police station and, on occasion, site of the Petty Sessions Court. Inspector Slack received her in the cramped office that smelled of coal smoke and damp paper. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Good of you to come so promptly. I'm speaking to everyone who was in the vicinity of the barber's shop on Thursday morning. Routine inquiries, you understand." "Of course, Inspector. I'm happy to assist in any way I can." "You passed the shop that morning, I'm told. Round about 10:30. Did you observe anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "I observed the usual Thursday morning scene. Mr. Crow was attending to a customer, and there were 3 people waiting. Mr. Hale, Mrs. Palmer, and young Mr. Lorimer. And they all appeared normal, nothing out of the ordinary in their behaviour. They appeared as one would expect people to appear while waiting for a barber," said Miss Marple, "though I did notice one small detail that struck me as slightly odd." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "What was that?" Mr. Hale had a hair on his sleeve, a dark hair, rather conspicuous against his light coat. It seemed unlike him to have overlooked it, as he is normally most particular about his appearance. The inspector wrote something in his notebook. "A hair on his sleeve," he repeated. "Dark, you say?" "Quite dark, almost black." "And you're certain it was before his appointment, not after?" "Quite certain. I was looking through the window as I passed, and he was waiting in the chair. not yet attended to. Inspector Slack nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's very observant of you, Miss Marple. Very observant indeed. Is there anything else you noticed?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said, "Only that the shop seemed peaceful, whatever happened to end. Poor Mr. Crow, I don't believe it occurred while his customers were present. The atmosphere was too ordinary, too undisturbed." "Perhaps," said the inspector, "or perhaps appearances can be deceiving." Miss Marple walked home in the gathering dusk, thinking of dark hairs and light sleeves and the many ways in which small inconsistencies could reveal large truths. Chapter 6. A Friendly Cue. Tuesday brought a change in the weather at last. The temperature rose slightly and the snow began to soften, dripping from eaves and forming small pools in the hollows of the high street. The village, which had been muffled and still under its white blanket, seemed to shake itself awake and resume something approaching its normal rhythm, though the closed barber's shop remained a silent reproach to any suggestion that life had returned to its usual course. Miss Marple spent the morning attending to her correspondence, a task she had been postponing for several days. There were Christmas cards to write, letters to answer, and a note of condolence to compose for Mr. Crow's sister in Bournemouth, whom she had never met, but who, according to the vicar, was the barber's only surviving relative. As she wrote, her mind returned repeatedly to the matter of the queue on Thursday morning. She had seen it only in passing through the shop window, but the image had fixed itself in her memory with unusual clarity. Mr. Hale in his chair nearest the window, upright and patient. Mrs. Palmer beside him, her handbag on her lap. Stephen Lorimer standing rather than sitting, his hands in his pockets, his gaze directed at the mirror. There was something about that arrangement that troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what it was. It was not unusual for people to queue at the barber's, particularly in the days before Christmas when everyone wished to be neat and presentable. But there was something in the particular composition of this queue, the specific individuals and their positions, that suggested a pattern she could not quite grasp. In the afternoon, she put on a coat and went to call on Miss Hartnell, who lived in a cottage near the church and who possessed the useful quality of knowing everyone's business without being particularly malicious about it. Miss Hartnell greeted her warmly and insisted on providing tea and a slice of seed cake that was somewhat dry but perfectly edible. "I've been meaning to call on you," said Miss Hartnell, settling into her chair with evident satisfaction at having company. "This dreadful business with Mr. Crow has upset the whole village. One doesn't like to gossip, of course, but one can't help hearing things." "I'm sure," said Miss Marple mildly, accepting her tea. "The village is naturally concerned. More than concerned, positively alarmed. Dr. Haydock won't say anything definite, but there's talk that Mr. Crow's death wasn't entirely natural. Something about the circumstances, though what exactly no one seems to know." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I imagine Inspector Slack will determine what happened. He's been very thorough in his questioning." "Oh, exhaustively thorough. He spoke to Mrs. Palmer for nearly an hour yesterday. She came out looking quite pale, poor woman. And he's been asking everyone who was in the shop on Thursday morning to account for their movements in the most minute detail. Mrs. Palmer was there, I understand, and Mr. Hale. Yes, and young Stephen Lorimer, quite a little gathering, really. Though I suppose it wasn't unusual. Mr. Crow's shop was always busy on Thursday mornings. It's the day before market day, you see, and the men like to be neat for their trip into town on Friday." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "I've been trying to remember the order in which they arrived. Mr. Hale was there first, I believe." "Oh, certainly. Mr. Hale is always first. Has been for years. He arrives at 10 o'clock precisely, winter and summer, and Mr. Crow always took him immediately. They had an understanding about it. Mr. Hale is very particular about his schedule." "And Mrs. Palmer?" Miss Hartnell pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Now that's interesting. Mrs. Palmer doesn't usually come to the shop on Thursdays. She generally accompanies her son on Saturday mornings. But last Thursday she was there, and from what I understand, she arrived somewhat later than Mr. Hale, perhaps 10:15 or thereabouts." "And Mr. Lorimer?" Ah, now there's a curious thing. Stephen Lorimer hasn't been to Mr. Crow's shop in years. Not since he left the village, which must be 7 or 8 years ago now. But he turned up on Thursday morning quite unexpectedly. I had it from Mrs. Jenkins, who saw him going in just as she was passing. She said he looked rather grim about it, as though he'd prefer to be anywhere else. Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. So Mr. Hale arrived first at his usual time. Mrs. Palmer arrived later than usual, on a day she wouldn't normally be there. And Mr. Lorimer appeared after an absence of many years, looking reluctant. Exactly so, and all of them there on the very morning that poor Mr. Crow— well, it does make one think, doesn't it? It makes one think a great deal, agreed Miss Marple. She left Miss Hartnell's cottage a short time later and walked slowly, toward home, considering what she had learned. 3 people, each with their own reason for being in the barber's shop that morning, yet none of their reasons quite aligned with their usual patterns. Mr. Hale, who valued regularity, had been following his routine, but Mrs. Palmer and Stephen Lorimer had both broken theirs. Why had Mrs. Palmer chosen Thursday morning instead of her usual Saturday visit? And why had Stephen Lorimer, after years away from the village, suddenly decided to have his hair cut at the very shop where he had once been publicly corrected? Miss Marple paused at the corner where the High Street met Church Lane and looked back toward the barber's shop. The afternoon light was fading and the building sat in shadow, its windows dark and its door firmly closed. The striped pole, she noticed, had been taken down. Someone, presumably acting on the instructions of Mr. Crow's sister, or perhaps the police, had removed it, and the bracket that had held it for so many years now stood empty. She thought of the queue as she'd seen it on Thursday morning, 3 people waiting, each in their customary manner. Mr. Hale sitting, because he always sat and waited with patient expectation. Mrs. Palmer sitting because she was a practical woman not given to unnecessary standing. Stephen Lorimer standing because perhaps sitting would have suggested a comfort or familiarity he did not feel. And what had they spoken of while they waited? The weather, undoubtedly. The approaching Christmas. Perhaps the state of the roads after the recent frost. The small, inconsequential topics that people discussed when making conversation with acquaintances who were not quite friends. But had they spoken of anything else? Had any of them said something that the others had noted? Had Mr. Crow, listening from his position behind the barber's chair, heard anything that gave him pause? Miss Marple had observed many years ago, in a case involving a dressmaker in another village entirely, that people who provided personal services often became the accidental repositories of confidences. The dressmaker had learned a great deal about her clients' lives simply by being present during fittings, when women spoke freely to one another and forgot that someone else was in the room, kneeling with pins in her mouth and a measuring tape around her neck. A barber was in much the same position. He stood behind his customer, visible in the mirror but somehow separate from the conversation, a pair of hands wielding scissors or razor, while the customer spoke to his own reflection or to the person waiting in the chair nearby. It was a position that encouraged forgetfulness, the assumption that what was said in such circumstances remained private even when it manifestly did not. Mr. Crow had been cutting hair in St. Mary Mead for over 30 years. How many confidences had he heard in that time? How many indiscretions mentioned? How many small secrets revealed? How many complaints about neighbours or employers or family members spoken aloud in the assumption that a barber, like a doctor or a priest, maintained professional discretion? And what happened when that discretion was threatened? When something learned in confidence became something that might need to be shared for reasons of conscience or concern or simple moral duty? Miss Marple turned into her own gate and walked up the path to her cottage. The garden was dripping steadily as the snow melted, and there was something melancholy about the sound, as though the earth itself were weeping for what had occurred. Inside, she removed her outdoor things and built up the fire, which had burned low during her absence. As she settled into her chair with her knitting, she found herself thinking not of the 3 people who had been waiting in the barber's shop on Thursday morning, but of the nature of waiting itself. Waiting was a vulnerable state. One sat or stood with nothing particular to do, one's attention available for whatever conversation or observation presented itself. One watched others come and go, noted their manner and their mood, observed small details that might otherwise pass unnoticed. A queue was not merely a line of people waiting for service. It was a temporary community, a small society with its own rules and dynamics. Some queues were companionable, with strangers chatting amiably to pass the time. Others were formal, with each person maintaining a careful distance and avoiding eye contact. What kind of queue had formed in Mr. Crow's shop on Thursday morning? Had it been friendly, with conversation flowing easily among the three people waiting? Or had it been strained, with each person keeping to themselves and speaking only when necessary? Miss Marple wished she had paid more attention when she passed the window. She had glanced in, noted the presence of the three people, observed the hair on Mr. Hale's sleeve and moved on, but she had not studied their expressions, had not noted whether they were speaking to one another or sitting in silence. Still, there were ways of determining what had occurred even without direct observation. People remembered conversations, particularly when those conversations had been uncomfortable or awkward, and in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, there were very few secrets that remained hidden for long. She thought of Mrs. Palmer's vagueness when asked about her visit to the shop. She thought of Mr. Hale's precision, his careful accounting of times and observations, and she thought of Stephen Lorimer, whom she had not yet spoken to, who had stood in the shop watching the mirror with that distant, preoccupied expression. Three people, each with their own reasons for being there, each with their own memories of what had been said and done, and one of them, perhaps, with a reason to ensure that Mr. Crow did not repeat what he had heard. Outside, the melting snow dripped steadily from the eaves, marking time in the gathering darkness. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted, her mind working through the problem with the same patient attention she brought to the pattern of her stitches. A queue was a simple thing, she reflected. People waiting their turn, passing time until they were called. But sometimes the simplest arrangements could become complicated when the wrong people found themselves together in the wrong place at the wrong moment. And sometimes what appeared to be a friendly queue could conceal something much less friendly beneath its surface civility. Chapter 7. What the Mirror Reflected. Wednesday morning brought a return of the frost, though less severe than before. The melted snow had refrozen during the night, creating treacherous patches of ice that required careful navigation. Miss Marple remained indoors until the sun had risen high enough to make walking safer, occupying herself with domestic tasks that had been neglected during the past few days. At 10:30, she received an unexpected visitor. Stephen Lorimer stood at her door, his cap in his hands and an expression of awkward determination on his young face. He was perhaps 26 or 27, tall and lean, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and eyes that suggested intelligence tempered by uncertainty. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wondered if I might have a word." Miss Marple showed him into her sitting room and offered tea, which he declined. He sat on the edge of the chair she indicated, holding his cap between his hands and turning it in a manner that betrayed considerable nervousness. "I understand you've been speaking with Inspector Slack," he said abruptly, "about Thursday morning, about the people who are in Mr. Crow's shop." "The inspector has been speaking to a great many people," said Miss Marple gently. "I provided what small assistance I could." "Yes. Well, the thing is, I've been thinking about that morning a great deal, more than I'd like to if I'm honest, and there's something that's been troubling me, something I saw but didn't quite register at the time." Miss Marple waited, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of patient encouragement. Stephen Lorimer took a breath. "The mirror," he said. "The large mirror in the shop, the one behind the barber's chair. It reflects the entire room, you see. Everything that happens, everyone who comes and goes. When you're waiting, you can't help but watch it. It's more interesting than looking at the walls or your own feet." "I imagine so," said Miss Marple. "I was standing there on Thursday morning waiting my turn. Mr. Hale was in the chair, having his hair cut. Mrs. Palmer was sitting in the waiting area, and I was watching the mirror, the way one does, not really thinking about it, just watching." He paused, and Miss Marple observed that his hands had tightened on his cap. "Go on," she said quietly. "The curtain to the back room was drawn," he continued. "It usually is when Mr. Crow is attending to a customer. But at one point it moved, just slightly as though someone had brushed against it from behind, and in the mirror I saw a shadow, very briefly, just a flicker of movement behind the curtain. Did you see who it was? No, it was too quick, and the curtain was in the way. But it was definitely someone moving in the back room. I remember thinking it was odd, because Mr. Crow was at the chair, working on Mr. Hale, and I hadn't seen anyone else go through. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Did Mr. Crow react to this movement? That's just it. I don't think he saw it. His attention was on his work and the angle of the mirror. He would have had to turn his head to see what I saw, but I noticed that he stopped cutting for a moment, just a brief pause, as though he'd heard something. And the others? Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Hale? Stephen shook his head. Mrs. Palmer was looking down at her handbag, going through it for something, and Mr. Hale had his eyes closed. People do when they're having their hair cut, don't they? Trust the barber and close their eyes. Indeed, said Miss Marple. So you alone saw this movement in the mirror? I believe so, though I can't be certain. I didn't mention it to anyone, because it seemed like nothing at the time. But now, with Mr. Crow dead and the inspector asking all these questions, I keep thinking about it, about what it might have meant. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the frost-whitened garden. You said you hadn't been to Mr. Crow's shop in many years. May I ask what brought you there on Thursday morning? The young man was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and somewhat strained. I'd been avoiding the shop since I came back to the village, since I came back to St. Mary Mead at all, really. I grew up here, but I left under rather difficult circumstances. Mr. Crow was part of those circumstances. He corrected you publicly, I believe, said Miss Marple, some years ago. Stephen looked up sharply. You know about that? Villagers remember such things, said Miss Marple, though often the details become unclear with time. What exactly occurred? I was 18, he said slowly, young and foolish and convinced I knew better than my elders. I had been working as a clerk in an office in town, and I took money from the petty cash. Not much, and I intended to replace it, but I was found out. My employer didn't prosecute, but he dismissed me, and the story got around the village. Mr. Crow heard about it, and one day when I was in his shop he spoke to me about it, very quietly, very firmly. He said that a man's reputation was earned by his actions, and that I had damaged mine, perhaps beyond repair. He said it in front of 2 other customers, and I've never forgotten it. That must have been painful, said Mr. Marple. It was humiliating, said Stephen. Oh, yeah. But he was right, of course. I knew he was right even then, which made it worse. I left the village shortly after and went to London. I've been working there ever since, doing my best to rebuild what I'd thrown away. But I came back for Christmas this year because my mother is unwell, and I thought perhaps enough time had passed that I might face the village again. And you went to Mr. Crow's shop? I went to apologize, said Stephen simply. I'd meant to do it years ago, but I never had the courage. And last week I thought, well, it's nearly Christmas, and if I can't make amends now, when can I? So I went on Thursday morning, intending to wait until he'd finished with his other customers and then speak to him privately. Did you have the opportunity to do so? No, there was always someone there, waiting or coming in, and then I lost my nerve and left. I told myself I'd come back another day, but of course there wasn't another day, was there? He died that very night, or sometime early Friday morning, and now I'll never have the chance to tell him I understood what he'd tried to teach me. Miss Marple returned to her chair and sat down, her expression thoughtful. This movement you saw in the mirror, behind the curtain, can you recall exactly when it occurred? What time, I mean? Stephen frowned. It must have been about 10, perhaps 25 past. Mr. Hale had been in the chair for 15 or 20 minutes, I'd say. Mrs. Palmer was still there, and I'd been waiting perhaps 10 minutes myself. And after you saw this movement, did anything else unusual occur? Not that I noticed. Mr. Crow finished with Mr. Hale, who paid and left. Then he began attending to Mrs. Palmer's son, who'd arrived by that time. I waited a bit longer, but as I said, I lost my nerve and left without speaking to Mr. Crow privately. After Stephen had departed, promising to share his observations with Inspector Slack as Miss Marple gently suggested he ought to do, Miss Marple sat by her fire and thought about mirrors and what they revealed. A mirror in a barber's shop was a peculiar thing. It showed you yourself, certainly, but it also showed you everything else. The room behind you, the people waiting, the comings and goings that occurred outside your direct line of sight. Customers watched themselves being transformed from untidy to neat, from overgrown to properly trimmed. But they also, whether consciously or not, watched the life of the shop reflected in that silvered surface. And what had the mirror shown on Thursday morning? A young man waiting nervously, hoping for a chance to apologise for an old transgression. A widow sitting with her handbag, her attention apparently occupied with its contents. A fastidious retired clerk with his eyes closed, trusting himself to the barber's care. And behind the curtain, someone moving in the back room. Someone who had perhaps been there all along unnoticed until that flicker of shadow betrayed their presence. Miss Marple thought of the layout of the barber's shop as she remembered it. The front room with its chairs and mirror, and the smell of bay rum. The curtained doorway leading to the back room where Mr. Crow kept his supplies, where he boiled his kettle and hung his coat. The back room had a door to the yard, she recalled, though it was rarely used in winter. Someone in the back room while Mr. Crow was working, someone who had caused the curtain to move, who had perhaps made a sound that caused the barber to pause briefly in his work. Who could it have been? Not one of the visible customers, certainly. Stephen had accounted for all of them. Mr. Hale in the chair, Mrs. Palmer in her seat, himself standing and watching. Someone else, then. Someone who had either been there when the shop opened or had entered through the back door from the yard. But why would anyone enter through the back? And why remain in the back room instead of coming through to the shop proper? Unless, of course, they had reason to avoid being seen. Reason to remain concealed behind the curtain, listening to what was said in the shop, waiting for an opportunity that did not immediately present itself. Miss Marple rose and fetched her writing paper. She would need to organise her thoughts, to set down what she knew and what she suspected, to separate the facts from the suppositions. But before she did that, there was one more person she needed to speak with. Mrs. Palmer had been vague about her visit to the shop. Stephen Lorimer had revealed that her son had indeed arrived and been attended to, but Mrs. Palmer herself had said she was there waiting for her son, which suggested she had arrived before him. Why would a mother arrive early to a barber's shop where her adult son was perfectly capable of managing his own appointment? Why sit and wait when she could have arrived at the designated time and accompanied him in? Unless, of course, she had not been there merely to wait. Unless she had come with some other purpose entirely, and the waiting was simply a convenient explanation for her presence. Miss Marple looked at the clock. It was nearly noon. Mrs. Palmer would likely be at home preparing her midday meal. It would not be inappropriate to call, particularly if one brought some small offering as an excuse for the visit. She went to her pantry and selected a jar of the marrow jam she had made in the autumn. Mrs. Palmer's son was fond of it, she recalled. It would serve as both a gift and an opening to conversation. Outside, the frost was yielding slowly to the weak winter sun. Miss Marple put on her coat and hat and set out, the jar of jam wrapped carefully in a bit of cloth and placed in her basket. There were questions that needed answering, and Mrs. Palmer, for all her careful vagueness, might hold the key to at least some of them. Chapter 8. Old Grievances Newly Neat. Mrs. Palmer's cottage stood in a row of similar dwellings that had been built, according to local history, for the workers of the estate that no longer existed. They were solid structures of grey stone with small gardens front and back, and they had weathered the passage of time with admirable resilience. Mrs. Palmer's cottage was distinguished from its neighbours by the particular neatness of its curtains and the well-tended rose bushes that flanked the front path, now dormant and bored beneath their winter mulch. Miss Marple approached the door and knocked gently. There was a pause and then footsteps, and Mrs. Palmer appeared, wiping her hands on her apron and looking faintly surprised to find a visitor on her threshold. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple. "I was passing and thought I might bring you this." She held out the jar of marrow jam. "I remembered that your son was rather fond of it." Mrs. Palmer's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind of you. "Please come in. I was just tidying up after luncheon." The cottage interior was as neat as one might expect from the evidence of the exterior. The sitting room was small but comfortable, with furniture that had been chosen for utility rather than fashion, and maintained with obvious care. A fire burned in the grate, and the mantelpiece held a collection of photographs in simple frames. Mrs. Palmer gestured Miss Marple to a chair, and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later without her apron, and carrying a tea tray that suggested she had been prepared for visitors even if she had not expected them. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said, pouring tea into cups of plain white china, "for your kindness after Mr. Crow's death. The vicar mentioned that you had spoken well of him." "He was a good man," said Miss Marple, "and a fixture of the village. His loss is felt by everyone." "Yes," Mrs. Palmer handed her a cup, and sat down with her own, her movements precise and controlled. "We were old friends, Mr. Crow and I. Not intimate, you understand, but we had known each other since we were children. One loses more than an acquaintance when someone like that dies. One loses a connection to one's own past." Miss Marple sipped her tea and waited. There was something in Mrs. Palmer's manner that suggested she wished to say more, but was uncertain how to proceed. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Palmer continued after a moment, "about the last time I saw him. About Thursday morning. I was there with my son, you see, and Mr. Crow was his usual self, or so I thought at the time. But looking back, I wonder if there wasn't something troubling him after all." "You mentioned to me before that he seemed worried, William," said Mr. Marple. "Yes, though I couldn't say what about. He wasn't a man who spoke freely of his concerns. He listened to others, but he kept his own counsel." Mrs. Palmer paused, her fingers tightening slightly on her cup. "There was something, though, a matter between us that had been unresolved for some weeks. I've been wondering whether it might have contributed to his state of mind." "If it helps to speak of it," said Miss Marple gently, "I am happy to listen." Mrs. Palmer set down her cup and looked at the fire. "There was an account," she said. "A small matter, really, but it had become awkward between us. Mr. Crow had done some work, not for me, but for my late husband's cousin. This was several months ago, before the cousin moved away. He left without settling the account, and Mr. Crow came to me about it, thinking that as family, I might know where to reach him." "And did you?" "No, my husband's family and I were never close, and after my husband died, we drifted apart entirely. I told Mr. Crow this, but he seemed to think I was being evasive. He asked me again a few weeks later, and I'm afraid I was rather short with him. I said that the debt was not mine to pay, and that he should not press me about it." "That must have been uncomfortable," said Miss Marple. "It was, particularly because I'd reason to believe that my husband's cousin had left the country entirely, and that Mr. Crow would never see his money. But I couldn't tell him that without explaining how I knew, and that would have meant revealing things about my late husband's family that were better left unsaid." Miss Marple observed the rigid set of Mrs. Palmer's shoulders, the careful control in her voice. "And on Thursday morning did Mr. Crow mention this matter again?" "No, that's what's been troubling me. I arrived at the shop before my son, intending to speak to Mr. Crow privately, and settle the matter once and for all. I'd decided to pay the debt myself just to have it finished. But when I got there, Mr. Hale was already in the chair, and young Mr. Lorimer was waiting, and I couldn't very well discuss money matters in front of them." "So you waited for an opportunity?" "I did. But the opportunity never came. My son arrived, and a Mr. Crow began attending to him, and all the while I was sitting there, knowing I should speak, but unable to do so without an audience. And then my son's appointment was finished, and we left, and I thought I would come back another day. But of course there wasn't another day." She fell silent, and Miss Marple could see the genuine distress in her face. Whatever else Mrs. Palmer might be concealing, her regret at not having settled this matter with Mr. Crow appeared to be sincere. "You said you arrived before your son," said Miss Marple. "At what time was that?" "Shortly after 10, I should think, perhaps 10 minutes past. I wanted to arrive early enough to speak with Mr. Crow before the shop became busy, but as I said, Mr. Hale was already there." "And you remained throughout your son's appointment?" Mrs. Palmer hesitated, and Miss Marple saw something flicker in her expression. "Not quite throughout," she said slowly. "I stepped out briefly about halfway through, just for a moment to post a letter at the box on the corner. I was back within 5 minutes." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And did anything unusual occur while you were gone?" "I wouldn't know, would I? I wasn't there." Mrs. Palmer's tone had become defensive. "My son said nothing about it when I returned, and Mr. Crow was working as normally as ever." Miss Marple let this pass without comment and turned the conversation to other matters. They spoke for a few minutes more about the approaching Christmas and the state of the weather, and then Miss Marple took her leave, thanking Mrs. Palmer for the tea and expressing her hope that the marrow jam would be enjoyed. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple turned over what she had learned. Mrs. Palmer had arrived early, hoping for a private conversation with Mr. Crow. She had waited, but the opportunity had not presented itself. And at some point during her son's appointment she had stepped out to post a letter, or had she? The posting of letters was a convenient excuse for a brief absence, and the box on the corner was visible from the barber shop window. If Mrs. Palmer had truly been posting a letter, surely someone would have noticed her. Unless, of course, she had not gone to the letterbox at all, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere less visible and less easily explained. Miss Marple's path took her past the greengrocer's, where she encountered de Haydock emerging with a bag of apples. He greeted her with his customary gruffness and fell into step beside her. "I suppose you've been asking questions," he said without preamble. "I know your methods, Miss Marple." "I've been conversing with my neighbour," said Miss Marple mildly. "If that constitutes asking questions, then I plead guilty." "Well, you might as well know what everyone will know soon enough. I've completed my examination and I've given my report to Inspector Slack. Alfred Crow did not die of natural causes." Miss Marple stopped walking. "I see. Heart failure certainly, but induced. Someone gave him digitalis, a considerable quantity of it, more than enough to cause a fatal arrhythmia in a man his age." "Digitalis," repeated Miss Marple. "From foxgloves?" "From foxglove tincture, more likely, or from heart medication if someone had access to it. The point is, it was deliberate. Someone wanted Alfred Crow dead, and they achieved their objective." They walked on in silence for a moment. The afternoon was drawing in, and the light had that pale, flat quality peculiar to December afternoons. "Did he know?" asked Miss Marple. "When it happened, did he understand what was occurring?" Dr. Haydock shrugged. "Difficult to say. The symptoms would have come on within an hour or two of ingestion. Nausea, confusion, visual disturbances. He might have thought he was simply unwell. By the time the cardiac effects manifested, he would have been too confused to call for help or to understand what was happening to him." "How terrible," said Miss Marple quietly. "Yes, well, there's worse in my opinion. At least it was relatively quick." He was found in the back room, behind the curtain, where he'd apparently gone when he felt unwell. The kettle was still warm, which suggests he'd made himself tea, probably hoping it would settle whatever he thought was wrong. And the digitalis would have been in the tea? Or in something he consumed earlier? But the tea seems most likely. It's easy enough to add tincture to a cup of tea, and he wouldn't have noticed if there was sufficient sugar to mask the bitterness. They had reached Miss Marple's gate, and she paused with her hand on the latch. "Dr. Haydock, when you examined Mr. Crow's shop, did you notice anything unusual about the smell?" The doctor frowned. "Smell? What do you mean?" "Bay rum. Mrs. Dew mentioned it was particularly strong." "Oh, that." "Yes, there was a broken bottle in the back room. Must have been knocked over during his distress. Made rather a mess, actually. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple. "I was merely curious." She watched as Dr. Haydock continued on his way, his bag of apples swinging at his side. Then she let herself into her cottage and removed her outdoor things with slow, thoughtful movements. Digitalis in the tea, a bottle of bay rum knocked over, a curtain that had moved betraying someone's presence in the back room, and 3 people in the shop that morning, each with their own reasons for being there, each with their own connection to Mr. Crow. Mr. Hale, who valued order and feared disorder in himself, Mrs. Palmer, who had wished to settle an uncomfortable matter but had found no opportunity, Stephen Lorimer, who had come to apologise for an old transgression. One of them had put digitalis in Mr. Crow's tea, or perhaps all three of them had known what was happening, and had chosen to say nothing, to look away, to maintain the polite fiction that everything was normal, even as the barber moved closer to his death. Miss Marple sat by her fire as the December darkness gathered outside. The pieces were beginning to come together, but the pattern they formed was not yet quite clear. She thought of old grievances and new opportunities, of things said in confidence and things better left unspoken, of mirrors that reflected everything and revealed nothing unless one knew how to look. And she thought of Mr. Crow, careful and discreet, who had known more than was good for him and had paid the price for that knowledge. Chapter 9, The Moment of Understanding. Thursday arrived exactly 1 week since Miss Marple had last seen Mr. Crow alive and attending to his customers with his customary care. The significance of the date was not lost on the village, and there was a subdued quality to the morning, as though everyone were conscious of the parallel and wished to mark it, however quietly. Miss Marple had slept better than she had in several days, which sometimes happened when her mind had worked through a problem and arrived at a conclusion, even if that conclusion had not yet been fully examined in the clear light of consciousness. She woke with a sense of clarity and purpose, and after breakfast she sat down at her small writing desk and began to set down in her neat, careful hand the various facts and observations that had accumulated over the past week. Mr. Crow, poisoned with digitalis, most likely administered in his tea, found in the back room where he had gone when feeling unwell, the kettle still warm, suggesting the poisoning had occurred not long before his death. The bottle of bay rum broken, knocked over in his distress. 3 customers present on Thursday morning. Mr. Hale, first as always, precise and controlled. Mrs. Palmer there unusually early and on the wrong day, with an unresolved grievance about money. Stephen Lorimer returned after years away, seeking to apologise for an old transgression. And someone in the back room, glimpsed only as a shadow behind the curtain, a flicker of movement in the mirror that only Stephen had noticed, because only he had been positioned to see it. Miss Marple put down her pen and looked out the window at the pale winter morning. The frost had returned during the night, and the garden lay still and white under its crystalline coating. She thought of Mr. Hale's meticulous nature, his need for order, his careful accounting of every detail when speaking to Inspector Slack. She thought of the dark hair on his light sleeve, noticed before his appointment, not after. Hair that was too dark to be his own grey strands. She thought of Mrs. Palmer's vagueness, her uncharacteristic failure to provide specific details about her visit. Her brief absence during her son's appointment, explained away as posting a letter that no one had seen her post. And she thought of Stephen Lorimer standing and watching the mirror, seeing what others had not seen because he alone had been looking in the right direction at the right moment. But most of all, she thought of Mr. Crow himself, a barber who had listened to confidences for 30 years, who had heard more than was good for him, who had known things about his customers that they would prefer remained private. Miss Marple rose from her desk and put on her coat. There was one more conversation she needed to have before speaking to Inspector Slack, and it could not be postponed. She found Mrs. Bantry at home, somewhat harried with preparations for a dinner party she was hosting that evening, but willing enough to pause for a few minutes when Miss Marple appeared at her door with an unusually serious expression. "Dolly," said Miss Marple, settling into a chair in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before answering. It concerns Mr. Hale." Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. "Mr. Hale? What about him?" "You've known him for many years. You know his habits, his temperament, his character. Tell me, does he use any heart medication? Digitalis preparations, for instance?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Why, yes, I believe he does. He mentioned it to Arthur some months ago when they were discussing health matters. He has a condition, I can't remember the precise name, but it requires him to take regular medication. Why on earth do you ask?" And would he have this medication with him generally? Or would he keep it only at home? I really couldn't say, though knowing Mr. Hale's habits, I should think he'd keep it close at hand. He's very particular about taking it at the proper times. He carries a small case with him, I believe, for his various necessities. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. And one more question, if you don't mind. Do you happen to know if Mr. Hale has any dark-haired relatives? Nephews, perhaps, or cousins? Dark-haired. Well, his nephew visited last month, I believe. Young man, works in London. Came down for a weekend. But what has that to do with anything? Perhaps nothing, said Miss Marple. Or perhaps everything. Thank you, Dolly. You've been very helpful. She walked home slowly, her mind assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. It was a picture she did not particularly wish to see completed, but truth, as she had learned long ago, was not always comfortable or kind. That afternoon she sat with her knitting and her tea and allowed her thoughts to settle into their final arrangement. People who valued order, she had said to Mrs. Bantry, often feared disorder most, especially in themselves, and Mr. Hale was nothing if not a man who valued order. His entire life was structured around regularity, precision, routine. His Thursday morning appointments with Mr. Crow, scheduled at exactly the same time for years, his careful dress, his meticulous habits, his need to account for every detail when questioned by the police. But something had disrupted that order. Something Mr. Crow had learned, something he had perhaps mentioned kindly but firmly, as was his way. Something that Mr. Hale could not allow to circulate, even accidentally, because it would shatter the carefully constructed image of respectability and control that he had maintained for so many years. What might that something have been? A confidence shared by a visiting nephew, perhaps? A revelation about some irregularity, some small dishonesty or indiscretion that Mr. Hale had thought safely concealed? The kind of thing that, once known by a discreet barber, might remain private, unless that barber felt a moral obligation to speak. Mr. Crow had said, according to Miss Marple's recollection, that he knew more than was good for him. He had been worried, according to Mrs. Palmer, distracted, according to Mr. Hale himself, and on Thursday morning Mr. Hale had arrived for his regular appointment, the first customer as always. He had sat in the chair with his eyes closed, trusting himself to the barber's care while the barber worked with scissors and comb and spoke, perhaps, of matters that needed to be addressed. The dark hair on the sleeve suggested a struggle, brief but significant. Not in the shop itself, where others might see, but in the back room, behind the curtain. A struggle that had resulted in the administration of digitalis, easy enough for a man who carried his own heart medication to obtain and prepare. The bay rum knocked over in the confusion, spilling its contents and filling the room with its sharp scent. And then Mr. Hale had returned to the chair, composed himself, allowed his hair to be cut as though nothing had occurred, had sat with his eyes closed and his hands folded, the very picture of patient submission, while Mr. Crow, already poisoned, had continued his work with the precision of long practice, not yet feeling the effects of what had been done to him. Mrs. Palmer and Stephen Lorimer had arrived to find the shop operating normally. They had waited, observed, departed. They had seen nothing because there had been nothing to see, not yet. The poison was already at work, but it would be hours before the symptoms became severe. Only Stephen had glimpsed that flicker of movement behind the curtain, that shadow that suggested someone. Mr. Hale, returning from the back room, had been where he should not have been. But Stephen had not understood what he was seeing, had dismissed it as inconsequential. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at the clock. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. Inspector Slack would still be at the police station, and she owed it to Mr. Crow's memory to share what she had concluded. She had no concrete proof, of course. The dark hair might have come from anywhere. The digitalis might have been administered by someone else entirely. The movement behind the curtain might have been innocent. But the pattern was clear to her, as clear as the pattern in her knitting, and she trusted her own observations even when they led to uncomfortable conclusions. Mr. Hale had valued order above all things. He had constructed a life of precision and regularity, and when that order was threatened by knowledge held by another, he had acted to preserve it, not in passion or sudden violence, but with the same careful planning he brought to every aspect of his existence. He had arrived early, as always. He had found his opportunity while the others waited, unsuspecting, and he had done what he felt necessary to protect the image he had spent a lifetime maintaining. That the cost was a man's life seemed not to have weighed heavily enough against the fear of exposure, the terror of disorder, breaking through the carefully maintained facade. Miss Marple put on her hat and coat once more and stepped out into the late afternoon cold. The sky was darkening already, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows as people drew their curtains against the December evening. She had always believed that truth mattered more than comfort, that justice required courage even when the consequences were painful. And so she would speak to Inspector Slack, would share her observations and her conclusions, and would allow the machinery of the law to determine whether her understanding was correct. As she walked toward the police station, she thought of Mr. Crow's words about mirrors hearing more than they showed. Sometimes, she reflected, the truth was visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. But it took more than looking to see, it took understanding of human nature, knowledge of the ways in which fear could drive even the most respectable person to desperate acts. The barber's chair had been a place of trust. That trust had been violated, and a good man had died because he had known too much and had perhaps been too honest for his own good. Miss Marple walked on through the gathering darkness, her steps steady and her purpose clear. Chapter 10, Christmas Eve, Set to Rights. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and a softening of the bitter cold that had gripped St. Mary Mead for the past fortnight. The village, despite the shadow that had fallen across it, was making its preparations for the festival with determined cheerfulness. Wreaths hung on doors, candles appeared in windows, and the church bell rang out its familiar summons to the morning service with a clarity that seemed to promise better days ahead. Miss Marple sat in the small parlour at the vicarage, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. The Reverend Clement occupied the chair opposite, his gentle face wearing an expression of profound sadness. Between them, the silence was companionable but weighted with the knowledge of what had occurred 3 days earlier. Inspector Slack had acted with his customary efficiency once Miss Marple had shared her observations. Mr. Dennis Hale had been taken into custody on Friday morning, pale and composed, offering neither protest nor denial. The village had absorbed the news with the stunned quietness of a community that had believed itself immune to such darkness. "He has made a full confession," said the vicar at last. "Inspector Slack told me this morning. It seems that Mr. Crow had learned, through conversation with Mr. Hale's nephew, of certain financial irregularities. Nothing criminal, perhaps, but dishonest nonetheless. Small deceits regarding his railway pension, claims for expenses that were not quite legitimate. The sort of thing that once exposed would have destroyed the reputation Mr. Hale had spent his entire life building." "And Mr. Crow intended to speak of it?" asked Miss Marple. "Maliciously, I think. But he felt a duty to address it, as he addressed young Mr. Lorimer's transgression all those years ago. He believed that correction, kindly administered, could lead to amendment. He did not understand that for some people the prospect of exposure is more terrible than any punishment the law might impose." Miss Marple thought of Mr. Hale's fastidious nature, his need for order and control, his terror of disorder, breaking through the careful surface of his life. "He could not bear the thought of being known as dishonest," she said quietly. "Not after all those years of presenting himself as the very model of precision and propriety." "No," agreed the vicar. "And so he acted to preserve his reputation, not understanding that in doing so, he destroyed it far more completely than any revelation of financial irregularity could have done." They sat in silence for a moment, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of Mr. Crow, who had tried to do right and had paid for it with his life. It was a familiar pattern, one she'd seen before in other villages, other circumstances. The good person who knew too much, the frightened person who acted to silence them, the tragedy that might have been prevented if only people could bear to be known as they truly were rather than as they wished to appear. Mrs. Palmer blames herself, I understand, said the vicar. She feels that if she had settled her account with Mr. Crow earlier, if she had not been there that morning creating an additional presence, perhaps Mr. Hale would not have had his opportunity. That is not logical, said Miss Marple. Mr. Hale would have found another opportunity if he had not found that one. Once he had determined on his course of action, he would not have been easily dissuaded. I have told her as much, but I fear she will carry the guilt for some time, as will young Mr. Lorimer, who feels he should have understood the significance of what he saw in the mirror. Also illogical, said Miss Marple firmly, but understandable. We all wish we had acted differently when we look back on events. It is the nature of hindsight to be clearer than foresight. The vicar smiled faintly. You are very wise, Miss Marple. Not wise, merely observant and perhaps more acquainted with the darker aspects of human nature than one might wish to be. She took her leave shortly thereafter and walked through the village toward home. The high street was busy with last-minute shopping, and she exchanged greetings with several neighbours who seemed grateful to have something ordinary to discuss, some respite from the weight of recent events. The barber's shop remained closed, its windows dark, the bracket for the striped pole standing empty like a memorial to what had been lost. Miss Marple paused before it for a moment, remembering the scene she had witnessed through that window just over a week ago. Mr. Hale in his chair, Mrs. Palmer with her handbag, Stephen Lorimer watching the mirror, all of them waiting, none of them knowing that they were witnesses to the prelude of murder. She walked on, and presently encountered Mrs. Bantry laden with parcels and looking flustered. Jane, thank goodness! I've been meaning to speak with you. This dreadful business with Mr. Hale, I can hardly credit it. He seems so respectable, so thoroughly decent. One never imagined such things about one's neighbours. One rarely does, said Miss Marple. That is rather the point, I think. We prefer to believe that evil comes from strangers, not from the people we know and greet on the street. But respectability is often merely a mask, and beneath it people are capable of surprising things when they feel threatened. I suppose so, but it's all very unsettling. To think that he sat in church every Sunday, looking so pious, while all the time he was planning, well, it doesn't bear thinking about. I doubt he was planning it for very long, said Miss Marple. More likely it was an impulse acted upon in a moment of panic, which makes it no less terrible, but perhaps slightly more comprehensible. They parted, and Miss Marple continued homeward through the softening afternoon. The sun, though weak, was doing its best to warm the frozen earth, and there was a hint in the air that the weather might turn milder for Christmas itself. That evening she sat by her fire with her knitting, listening to the church bells calling the faithful to the Christmas Eve service. She would attend later for the midnight service that she had observed faithfully for more years than she cared to count, but for now she was content to sit quietly and reflect on what had passed and what had been learned. People spoke freely in confidence, she thought, and sometimes they forgot who was listening. Mr. Crow had listened for 30 years, discreet and trustworthy, until the day when his discretion had conflicted with his conscience, and he had felt compelled to speak. And Mr. Hale, frightened and desperate, had silenced him in the only way he knew how, not with violence or passion, but with the same methodical care he brought to every aspect of his existence, digitalis in the tea, administered while the others waited unsuspecting, a bottle of bay rum knocked over in the brief struggle, a return to the barber's chair, composed and controlled, while the poison did its work.